Welcome, welcome, and Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. So we are looking at Torah Temimah this morning, and this happens to be a favorite Torah Temimah of mine, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much. So we are in the chapter. In fact, we've gotten to chapter 3 here, where the snake is engaging Eve, and he says to her, did God really tell you that you couldn't eat from any tree in the garden? From any tree in the garden? And she says, V'tomer ha'isha el hanachash, the woman said to the serpent, Mi pri eitz hagan nochel, we can eat from the fruit of the tree of the garden. Umi pri eitz asher betoch hagan, but from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, Amar Elohim, God said, Lo tochlu mimenu, you shouldn't eat of it, Lo tig'u bo, nor should you touch it, pen tumuton, lest you die. And this little phrase here is going to be the basis of our discussion to do today. All right. So, velo tig'u bo, you shall nor shall you touch it. Amar Chizkiah, so this sage by the name of Chizkiah said, Minayin shekol hamosif korea. From where do we get the principle that anyone who adds actually reduces? Shinemar, as it says, Amar Elohim lo tochelu mimenu velo tig'u bo, where because it says that Eve said, the Lord has said, you shall, or God has said, you shall not eat from it, nor touch it, nor touch it. And this is from the tractate Sanhedrin. So let's take a look at Torah Temimah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo hizhira al hanigiyah. The fact is, of course, that God never said a word about touching. Never, not a word. V'hi ba'atzma hosifa. And we see that she is adding it herself. She's the one who's adding those words. Umitoch kach nistavev geraon. And this whole reduction took place. In other words, that they weren't going to fulfill the mitzvah itself. They would wind up actually eating it. Shedachaf hanafchash et chava al ha'ilan. Because the story goes, this is of course oral tradition, that the snake pushed Eve against the tree, ad shenagabo, to a point where now she touched the tree. So he pushed her against the tree and she touched it. Amarla, and the serpent said, Re'i, look, she'ein mita al hanigiyah, there wasn't any death regarding the touching of it. V'kach lo tamuti af al hachila. And just as there wasn't any death involved in touching it, you're not going to die either if you eat it. V'ien od lefanenu, and look further before us, the Parshat Trumah, in the Parsha of Trumah, in the book of Exodus, the Pasuk Matayim v'chetzi orko, where it says it's 2.5 cubits was its length, drasha me'enzo, a similar kind of interpretation. So we have something to look forward to. Ukvar hirgishu harbe hamafashim, and already many commentators sensed the koshianyan, that there's an internal problem here. What's the problem? She'im ha'isha hosifa mida'ata hatzivui denegiyah, that if the woman herself, if she herself was the one who added that little point about not touching, hareyad ha'emet, she would have known. She would have known, in fact, Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu lo tziva al nigah. She herself would have known that God, the Holy One, blessed be He, had never made any commandments regarding touching the tree. V'im kain, and if this is the case, ech nit fatata, L'divrei hanachash. How was she seduced by the words of the snake, of the serpent? She wouldn't have been surprised, of course. She herself had added it. So what's the big surprise here that she didn't die? She'amar kashem she'ein mita ala negi'ah, kach ein mita af ala achila. So by his statement to her, well, you see, you didn't die when you touched it. You're not going to die when you eat it. Aval be'emet. But the truth is, ha'inyan, be'emet ha'inyan mevu'ar ma'od ba'avot derabi Natan. He says this is actually explained, the whole way in which this works is explained very, very well and very clearly in another midrash called the Avot derabi Natan. The fathers of Rabbi Nathan is the name of the book. The book exists, and Perik Aleph, and in the first chapter, Sheba'et Shemasar Adam Harishon Lechava, that at the time, this is what it says in the Avot derabi Natan, at the time when Adam, the first man, when Adam transmitted Lechava to Eve, Tzivav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God's command about not eating from the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay. Make sure, I'm sorry, here we go. Sieg lidvarav, asa siag lidvarav. He made a fence for his words. Va'amar lo la isur gam alanigia. He made a fence around the eating it, and he said, you're not even allowed to touch it. Right? And so by saying that you couldn't even touch it, it was a fence in the sense that if you can't even touch it, then for sure you're not going to eat it, because you're not going to even get to it to eat it. So that's the fence, right? Kedei shetahei suga b'shimur me'achila, so that it would be protected by this fence in being careful not to eat of it. The imkain, and if this is the case, that he was the one, that Adam was the one who told her about not touching it and saying that God had said not to touch it. In that case, of course, Eve would think that the Holy One, blessed be He, had commanded regarding touching it. And according to this version, Masha Amar Kol HaMosif Gorea, and for that reason, we realize what he said, Kol HaMosif Gorea, anyone who adds actually detracts. Lo ka'el chava, that statement doesn't apply to Eve, ela al Adam. That refers to Adam, who was adding and consequently was reducing. The tam hasiag negi'ah shosif Adam harishon midato, and the reason, right, behind the fence that he, quote, of touching, which Adam, the first Adam, added from on his own thought, right? He himself. Lichora eino mevuar. It's not so clear, right? Hechi teta da'ala al da'ato. How exactly, in other words, it's not so clear. Where on earth would he have thought, right? Lehosif siag kazeh, that he should add such a type of fence. V'alo stam ma'achalot asurot ein asurot b'negiah. Well, we know, right, in our own tradition, that there are foods that are forbidden, right? We have forbidden foods, but there is no prohibition about touching these things. You know, where this coming from? Our own tradition, we have foods that we're not allowed to eat, but nothing about touching them. V'yesh lomar, and one might argue, right, might say, al pi hasvara shakatfu haposkim, according to the rationale which the halachic decisors, in other words, the people who determine Jewish law, they wrote, B'tam hadavar shemutar liga ba'ochlin b'yom ha'kippurim. Okay? Regarding on whether the matter is, are you allowed to touch these foods on Yom Kippur? Okay, any other time you can't, but on Yom Kippur, you're not allowed to touch the foods, right? Or are you? Right? v'lo chayshinan, and we are not worried, shema yavo le'echol. So that's the thing. You are even allowed to touch you're allowed to touch food, right? Any food on Yom Kippur, and we're not worried, right? So on the one hand, on Yom Kippur, right, we are allowed to touch food on Yom Kippur, and there's no concern that a person might want to eat it or come to eat it. But on the other hand, in Pesach, you're not even allowed to touch leaven, Shema Yavo Lachol. In that case, lest one comes to eat it. So why the difference? And the reason is that on Yom Kippur, and the difference is that on Yom Kippur, you stay away from any kind of food at all. Lo chayshinan. So consequently, we're not suspicious, we're not worried, Shema Yavo Lechol, that he's going to come to eat, because he's not allowed to eat any food at all. But that doesn't apply to the issue of chametz on Pesach, shezulat chametz, because with the exception of chametz, ochlim hakol, you're allowed to eat anything that's kosher, right? You're just not allowed to eat chametz. Chayshinan shema yavo lechol, and that's why we're worried that you might actually, if you touch chametz, you might wind up eating it. Because eating is allowed on Pesach. It's just not chametz. And so consequently, if you're touching chametz, it's possible you might put it in your mouth to eat. Gametzeh, in other words, you might wind up eating chametz as well. V'lachin asru gam b'nigia. And that is the reason why you're not allowed to touch chametz on Pesach. And he gives you the references in the codes. Yein Orech Chaim, check out the Shulchan Aruch, Orech Chaim, Siman Tarya Ben. He gives you the chapter number, and that would be chapter, looks like 612, and then Seif Vav, paragraph 6, Uve Magen Avraham, one of the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, the Magen Avraham. ולפי זה, מכיוון שעץ הדת עמד בתוך שאר הלינות, so look, this looks like this is the rationale, right? The tree of knowledge stood in the midst of other trees, שמכולן הותר לאכול, of which human beings are allowed to eat. They were allowed to eat from any of those trees. Kemoshe Katov, just as it states, Mikol Eitz Hagan Ochol Tochel. God says you can eat from any tree in the garden. This is very similar to the situation of chametz b'Pesach, and that's why you wouldn't be able to touch it, because you can eat from all the other trees, and so you might wind up eating from this tree, and that's why you shouldn't even touch it. V'lachein hayadan le'esor gam b'nigia. And for this reason, Adam reasoned that it makes sense to forbid even touching it, v'dok. And this is a good proof, the good proof. But there's still a difficulty. There's still a problem. Ma shekatuv kol hamosif goreya, because it says anyone who adds actually reduces, actually takes away. V'halo kamuvuar haita hahosafa mitzad hadin. Well, and when it seems that according to reason, there was a reason for this addition, that there was good reason for this addition. V'alo sofa min hadin, and with regards to a reasonable, a rational introduction of a siyag, right? Ein shayach lo mashu gir'un v'chaser. One shouldn't be saying that there's actually a reduction. You're taking away from it, and you're now making it lack something. V'tzarich lomar. So how do we get around this problem? One has to say, mishum deyesh lechalek zeh me'erech chametz b'Pesach, that there's something essentially different about this situation and the situation of chametz and Pesach. Ya'an, because ki hachametz hayalo sha'at hakosher leheter. And the difference is that there are, other than on Pesach, you are allowed to eat chametz. And for this reason, because one is allowed to eat chametz any other time of the year, it's really possible for a person to eat it. Persons used to eating chametz. But this does not apply to the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Adam, okay, from which Adam was forbidden. Lo haya lo me'olam shat heter. There was never a time when that fruit was permissible. V'hei kenevela devedil midei. And it was like nevela. It's a category of meat that hasn't been properly shechted that you want to stay away from. You never would have anything to do with it. And in this case, because one never would have been allowed to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, there is no reason to be worried about the need to prevent a person from touching it. The imke, and if this is the case, lo havei lehosif isur negia, and on the basis of this, he never should have added that prohibition against touching it. The imkein haita hasafa legeraon, and for this reason, this additional stricture of not touching it actually wound up getting him into trouble, right? It was actually a reduction of the mitzvah. Ukisavarazo, and according to this kind of argumentation, Katav Hashach, the Siftei Kohen, wrote the Yoredeya in another book of the Shulchan Aruch, Yoredeya, Siman Peitet, and this is the chapter, right? 89, forgive me, 89, Sif Katan Dalid, subparagraph 4, to afal pisha asur leha'alot al hashulchan she'ochel alav basar, right? Even though it is forbidden to place on a table where he's eating meat, ma'achalei chalav, to put milchiks on there, dairy products, aval basar nevela mutar. But on the other hand, to put meat nevela, in other words, unkosher meat on this table, mutar, you're allowed to do that. Why? Mishum de nevela bedil adamine, because of the fact that when it comes to nevela, right, a person has nothing to do with it, right? There's no situation where a Jew would be allowed to eat nevela. However, when it comes to milchiks, of course, we are allowed to have milchiks. And that's why you can't put milchiks and meat and dairy on the same table, because of the fact that we're allowed to eat them separately. And there's a possibility, because of that very fact that you're allowed to have milk, that if you're having meat, you might wind up having something that's dairy as well, if it's on the table. So, any comments on this? Let me pause this. I'm going to stop the share. Any thoughts about this? Were you able to follow the logic? No? Yes? Anyway, I thought that it was, when I first read this, I found it really insightful, right?
I think it's really helpful too.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought of it in that way. Well,
Right.
I never did. So thank you.
I know. For me, when I first read this, it was like uncovering a mystery, because I thought the questions were such good questions that they were asking, and he was coming up with such good answers to these questions. And it's like when you watch a good detective, noticing slight variations that make a whole difference in which the way you look at the case. And that's exactly what was going on, was to see the slight variations that between these situations. So, and I think I'm going to leave it for today, and I'm going to stop the recording.